Hello, everybody. This is episode 82 of the Intercooler Podcast. And I suppose we don't really need a reason, do we, Andrew, to talk about Porsche 917s? They're just sort of interesting enough.
There's no anniversary, there's no hook, there's no special announcement for a Porsche. We're just going to do it.
Yeah, we're just going to do
917.
I think there are a couple of reasons, though, why we're doing it now. Because last week we did car films and motorsport films.
Yeah.
We spoke about the film Le Mans, the McQueen film Le Mans, and 917s do feature. So that might have sort of sparked this idea. Although there is an anniversary that we can hang this off. I mean, we don't always need anniversaries to give us a reason to talk about a particular topic. But a couple of days ago, it was the 50th anniversary of Joe Siffert's death, wasn't it? And he raced.
Oh, blimey. Yes. Well, okay, fine. Yes, that is as good a reason as you need to talk about 917. I hadn't appreciated that fact, I'm afraid. But yes, absolutely. So that's, absolutely.
And it's actually, I only mention it because his funeral cortege was led by 917.
There you go. And in fact, well, this is also the year in which 50th anniversary of Pedro Rodriguez's death. So yeah, his was earlier in the year. So yes, neither of them died in 917s. Pedro was in a private 512M at the Norris Ring. Joe was in a Lotus 49 at Brands Hatch. Or was he? No, Pedro was in. No, Joe was in a. He was in something else, wasn't he? He wasn't a Lotus 49 at all. It'll come back to me. He was in a BRM, wasn't he? He was in a BRM. Sorry,
yeah, it was Brands Hatch.
He won. He won the British Grand Prix in '68 in a Lotus 49 at Brands Hatch. That's why I got confused. Sorry. Move on.
Before we do start talking about 917s, though, I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the film Grand Prix, because last week you declared it one of your favourite films. I had to confess that I hadn't seen it.
I couldn't believe you hadn't seen it.
Yeah. So I promised that I'd put it right, and I did. I did watch it over the weekend, and it was brilliant, really enjoyable.
Yeah, good film.
Yeah, it has that at points. It has that sort of lovely slow pacing of films of that era that you just don't really get now, and some fairly ropey acting at points.
Yeah, but some amazing cinematography.
Well, that's what I was going to say. The race sequences, I couldn't believe how evocative they were, how immersive they were. So much better than anything you'd get now, because you'd never have a long lingering shot from the front of one car looking at another as they're herring around at 150 whatever, and that shot will last 10 seconds or something. You can imagine in a comparable film today, it would be chopped together multiple times, lots of cuts, lots of edits. There'd be music going. You wouldn't hear the cars. You wouldn't get an impression of the speed.
Also, those sort of shots you get of sort of rev counters flicking up and down. Well, I mean, no one would even be allowed to look into the the cockpit of a modern Formula One car, and Venturi opening in intake trumpets and all that sort of thing. Just that really loving detail. I mean, to me, it's almost shot as it looks almost like somebody has decided to do a retrospective on these amazing race cars. But of course, at the time, they're all brand new, weren't they?
Yeah.
And there's a love for the machinery in that film that it's hard to feel for modern cars, aren't they? Which are just, and you kind of think that even back then, people, just because they were so beautiful and because they sounded so amazing and because they were driven by genuine heroes, none of those things being true today, that there was a love and a reverence for the machinery itself. That simply doesn't exist anymore, because I mean, however fast and amazing modern Formula One cars are, they are just vessels for carrying their drivers around the tracks. And they, I'm sure the people who create them love them. But as looking on, we don't look at a modern Formula One car and go, oh my God, that's the most beautiful thing to say, or listen to that Formula One car. All we think is, gosh, that's fast. And that's what I love about that film, is even when they were making it in period, there was this adoration of the subject.
Yeah. Somehow they knew, didn't they?
And
you really get to see what tracks like Monaco, Brands Hatch, Spa, Zandvoort and Monza were like at the time, in a way that you just don't from still images, or perhaps if you could find the television footage from the day, I don't know, but you get such a sense of how the circuits have changed, what they looked like then, what the challenge was like back then. Monaco, I mean, the place is a concrete jungle, isn't it? But back in the 60s, it actually looked quite beautiful. And I just loved seeing places like Monza with the banking, the old Spa. It was brilliant to really get a feel for what those places were actually like back then.
And they actually entered, I think, Phil Hill, okay, he wasn't quite retired, but he wasn't racing Formula One anymore. But they entered him into the 1966 Belgian Grand Prix just to get that footage. Wow. So that amazing footage when they're all piling off the start. Is, that's real stuff. That was done by a very brave bloke who got back into a Formula One car after being out for a while, and sort of haired round and got all that stuff. It's it was all it was all done properly. It was all done at real racing speeds because they couldn't do it any other way. They didn't have any green screens or CGI or anything. They just had to get on and do it.
There were a couple of crash sequences which are actually quite frightening, and you sort of get a bit of an understanding of how attitudes towards death in motorsport have changed over the years. Particularly Scott Stoddard's crash quite early on in Monaco. You really see, well, it's not him obviously, but you see, perhaps it's a doll or whatever, but you see that doll really being flung around when the car crashes. And then there's just a shot of him sort of unconscious in the car, bloodied and bruised, looking in a terrible shape. And actually that is quite shocking because I suspect it's quite an authentic depiction of what happened.
I mean, it's absolutely, the tales of the safety or lack of safety and how cavalier people were about life back in the day and how difficult it was to get the correct medical treatment. I mean, I just try to think of various examples. There was a bloke who crashed at Spa in the 1960s, one of the tailors, Michael Henry, can't remember which one, but any one of them. It took them 40 minutes to find him because it was such a long lap. No one saw him go off because there were so few marshals around. He had a career-ending injury, okay, and he'd gone so far that by the time the car didn't come around, the guys in the pits thought, oh, maybe we missed him, so they wait another lap, and he still doesn't come around. They thought, oh shit, he's gone off somewhere. Well, we haven't heard anything, and then they start looking for him, and it literally, and this poor bloke is lying there in the wreckage, terribly injured, and no one's coming. And that's what it was, and also, if you had, there was that awful accident at Monaco in '67 where Lorenzo Bandini overturned his Ferrari and it caught fire, and they kept racing. He was in the car, it was on fire, it was upside down, and think about how he suffered. And eventually they got to him and they put it out, and there are people taking photographs all over the place, and and they get, and I think he lived for about 3 days after that, and before finally succumbing to his injuries. And you just think about how he must have suffered, and it's beyond my, I don't choose to think about it, actually. It's just too horrendous for words, but that was kind of like back then. It had this sort of gladiatorial quality to it, and people just didn't take that side of things remotely seriously, and you get what you get.
And you do get an impression of that from this film Grand Prix. So I mean, it's definitely worth watching. I watched it on Amazon. Amazon Prime is very easy to find. It is worth watching, but some of it is fairly eye-opening, I have to say. Okay, but we're actually talking about 917s, aren't we? And
yes, and there's obviously a film link there to the McQueen movie, so beautifully done, if I may say so.
Well, thank you very much, as if it was planned. So, I mean, really, the 917 is most famous, isn't it, for giving Porsche its first outright wins at Le Mans, 1970, 1971. But I think it is one of the great endurance racing cars, isn't it? Maybe the great one. It's sort of celebrated in a way that I'm just not sure that modern day endurance races ever will be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Back in the day, and I'm talking 20-something years ago when I was the editor of Motorsports, we just wanted to poll. We didn't put it out to the public for some reason, but we just got hold of as many people whose opinions we trusted and respected. So there were a lot of racing drivers. I mean, Bernie did it, Ron did it. I mean, lots of eminent names. A few scumbag journalists like me, and we just had to name the world's greatest racing car ever. Didn't specify a formula, whether it be a single seater or a sports car or anything else, and the 917 won it.
Wow.
So 20 something years ago, and in the eyes of those people who were a fairly eminent bunch, the 917 was it. Of all racing cars, it was the greatest racing car that had ever been devised. And I think for all sorts of reasons, I think because it was so successful on both sides of the Atlantic. So it obviously went on to have this career in Can-Am after it stopped being a sports car. I think the reason for its creation is a fairly extraordinary story, and obviously the car itself, just how much faster it was than anything else out there, and also I think that there is a romance to it because of just how ridiculously brave you had to be to even sit in the thing and head out around a racetrack with all those other lunatics. So and I think it's a gorgeous looking car too, and I think it's a car that just has so many stories. I mean, talk about podcast. I mean, I could do a pod week on this thing because I just don't think we've ever seen anything like it before or since.
So where do we begin then? Should we go back to the middle of 1968 when Porsche started developing this thing?
Yeah, I mean, can we talk a bit about how it even got to exist? Because I mean, the point being was that the rules were redrafted in such a way to ensure that such a car could never exist. Because cars were with things like the Ferrari P4 and particularly the 7-litre GT40, which were pure prototypes made by the handful, because they were so expensive and they were so fast, and people were having bigger and bigger accidents, more and more lives were being lost, and the rule makers just said enough, okay, let's we're gonna stop this stuff. So they're going to say, okay, fine, so you can still make prototypes, that's absolutely fine, but if you make a prototype, you've got a 3-litre engine capacity, so that'll slow you down. So none of this 7-litre nonsense. And if you don't want to play that game, that's absolutely fine. You can build a car with a 5-litre engine, but you're going to have to make 25 of them. So that's not, you say, so you're not going to build 25 prototypes, because that'd be ridiculous. So that's the end of those really, really fast cars. And Ferdinand Piech at Porsche just thought, sod them, we'll build 25. We'll just do it, and we'll sell them. And that's how the 917 came into being. And there's that amazing photograph of the day the FIA came to inspect, and there are 25 917s in a line. I don't think the FIA quite realized there were, I mean, I can't remember how many cars that were actually sort of capable of moving under their own steam were in that photograph, because I think the vast majority of them had literally just been thrown together, and were, as soon as they'd taken the photograph and the FIA had gone, they were taken to bits again and rebuilt as sort of proper racing cars. But nevertheless, they showed that they could do it. And at that stage, they had no choice. They had to let them race. And Ferrari saw this too late and thought, shit, I've got to do something about this. And came up with the 512S, which against anything else would have been the greatest racing car of its era. But because they were reacting to a situation that was pre-existing, they didn't have the time, and they came up with a car which was less powerful, which was heavier, less good, and the 917 off it went.
So let's talk about some of the more interesting technical aspects, but also the people involved. You mentioned Ferdinand Piech, who sort of oversaw the whole thing. Hans Mezger, chief engineer. Amazing, actually. There's such a lovely connection there. Anyone who's got a sort of early-ish 911 GT3 or GT3 RS with a Mezger engine in it, the bloke who did the engine in your car did the 917. It's just a cool connection, isn't it? Something to be proud of if you're lucky enough to own one of those cars. And so who else were the significant people involved? Piech and Mezger, but I mean, there must have been.
But there was also, it was the first job that Norbert Singer had at Porsche too. I mean, he was pretty junior, and I think he was working on on the transmission at the time, but he was there too. I mean, it was just this extraordinary brains trust, wasn't it, of the most amazing engineers, with an attitude which was, we'll do the impossible, because if we do the possible, we'll do something that's been done before. We don't want to do that. And it was a very pragmatic car. It's another thing that I don't think people appreciate, is they had so little time. They didn't have a huge amount of money. So, they took their 908, which was, a very good car in its own right, and had won all sorts already. Daytona 24 Hours and so on and so forth. And they took that gorgeous flat 8 engine, and they literally just added a cylinder to each corner, and created the flat 12. But even then, and it gives you some idea of the limitations they were working under. You could have a car of 5 litres. Well, they didn't, because if you have a 3 litre 8-cylinder engine, and you add a cylinder to each corner, that gives you 4.5 litres. So the early 917s were 4.5 litre cars, because they had the same bore and stroke as the 908. With a car like that, you want to have 4 valves per cylinder, obviously. Well, they couldn't, because they were air cooled. And there wasn't enough space to cool the engine properly if you had 4 valves, so they had to have 2 valves per cylinders. Porsche only got around to sorting that problem out with the 956 in the 1980s, when they finally went to water-cooled heads. And so, they had an engine which wasn't as big as it could be. It didn't have the number of, it had half the number of valves probably should have had, and it still had more power than anything else out there. Ferrari had the full 5 litre engine. And the Porsche was, from the outset, with 4.5 litres, significantly more powerful. And of course, the car was made out of this tiny lattice frame, sort of spidery space frame, which weighed nothing.
42 kilograms, apparently.
Yeah.
Which is, that really is nothing.
Yeah. And they put this fiberglass skin over the top, which in space is less than a millimetre thick. And so, and off they went. And I mean, it was quick from the outset. It wasn't that quick from the outset, because it was almost impossible to drive. And so in 1969, I mean, the Ferrari didn't come out until 1970, because, as I said, they were reacting to it. So in 1969, the absolute truth is, the Porsche drivers of the era didn't want to drive it.
Yeah. So hang on, we'll come to that in just a sec. But it's worth mentioning that it did use some exotic materials, titanium, magnesium alloys as well, to make it as light as possible. Now, it was quite a compact car with an enormous engine behind the cockpit, and it meant that the drivers had to sit a long way forward. Perhaps one of the reasons why some of them weren't too keen on it. I mean, when we talk about the weight of the chassis, I mean, that's a good thing from a performance point of view. But when you look at how spindly it is, where the driver's feet are forward of the front axle line, I mean, it is extraordinary that anyone chose to actually race that thing at any great speed, because it's just not going to survive a big accident, is it? That car, that chassis.
If you look at the front of 911, usually there's a little panel which you can unscrew at the front, and if you take a bit of bodywork off, you can look down, and you will see this tiny tube of space frame, and then behind that are the pedals, and behind that are the feet, and that is literally all you have between you. I mean, it's almost like a coat hanger, and and so they learned very quickly, and they did they went out specifically to achieve that. If they were going to go off, and they suddenly, in that moment, racing drivers can do this, and when they think, okay, I'm going to crash, what are my options?
Oh my God.
They learnt to go in backwards. And that was a specific thing with the 917, because they knew that if they went in forwards, at the very best, they weren't going to come out of that with a career anymore. And so that's what happened. It just doesn't bear thinking about, does it, in these in these days?
No, and sadly, people did lose their lives in 917s, didn't they?
Well, in 1969, John Wolfe lost his life, but that was briefly. Porsche go to Le Mans in 1969. They have one privateer car, which is owned by this British driver called John Wolfe. And he shouldn't have been in the car. The car was too undeveloped. It was too unstable. He frankly wasn't a good enough driver. So he was going to share. This is an interesting story. He was going to share it with a chap called Digby Martland. Digby happens to be an old family friend of mine, and he was a fantastic driver. He was really good at racing chevrons and that sort of thing. And so his mate invites him to come and drive this 917 thing at Le Mans. And Digby goes out and it's in it was practice or qualify, but the car is so unstable at over 200 miles an hour, he spins it down the Mulsanne Straight and somehow doesn't connect with anything. Gets it back to the pits, gets out of the car and says to John Wolfe, I'm never going to drive this thing again, and if you've got any sense, you won't either. And he left. And Richard Atwood, obviously the bloke who won the Mans in 917 the following year, has always said he thought that was one of the bravest things he ever saw any racing driver ever do, just to accept that this was beyond you and to get out and walk away. I'm not sure Digby raced really very much at all after that. And sadly, John Wolfe said, well, it was his car and it was at Le Mans and he was going to have his moment in the sunshine. And so Porsche gave him Herbert Linger, who was the factory test driver, massively experienced racing driver. And they begged him to let their driver take the start. But John Wolfe said no, because the car might break. And then I went to race my 917 at Le Mans, so I will take the start. And so off they all hair at the start. And he never came back. Didn't make it around the first lap. Lost control at Whitehouse, massively fast corner, not on the circuit anymore. And that was that. They just saw the smoke curling up from the horizon.
Bloody
terrible.
Hell. Yeah, that is terrible. You've touched on it. But the car became enormously successful and almost unbeatable. But to begin with, it was anything but. And the guys just didn't like the car, did they? In the podcast that you did, the TI Super podcast for app subscribers only that you did with Richard Atwood, he says that they were leading Le Mans in '69, but he hated the car so much he was delighted when it broke.
He said he'd never been happier in his life.
Yeah,
21 hours in, they were leading by a ridiculous amount, laps and laps and laps. No one else anywhere near him, and it breaks. And he's deaf. He has a headache which would last for days. He's exhausted. He's terrified because the thing's going down the straight like this. He says he could sit in that car and look in the mirror at 200. I mean, it would do back then with the long tail at 969. It would do about late 230s down the straight. And he could see the horizon moving in the mirror as the back of the car came off the ground. And then you get wheel spin at 200, whatever it was. And Vic Elford always said that he enjoyed driving that car, and I think that Richard is fairly what's the word? I don't know. I'm not sure that I think Richard probably thinks that Vic is being slightly revisionist in his thinking there, but maybe not. But anyway, the car was an absolute nightmare. I mean, it was unbelievably fast, but it was almost uncontrollable.
Aerodynamically unstable, wasn't it? That's the key thing.
Yeah, but Porsche didn't realize it because the computers were so primitive at the time. They thought the problem was in the suspension, and it wasn't. And it was only when it got sorted out over the winter of 1969 to 1970, and as Richard Atwood would tell you, it went from being the worst racing car he'd ever driven to the best racing car he'd ever driven, literally over the course of a winter break.
Yeah,
and in 1970 it comes back and off you go. And
those 1970 cars look very different to the 69 car, don't they?
Yeah,
you can see it in images. They changed so much over that winter.
Well, they didn't have a short tail in 1969. So back then cars used to race with long tails or short tails depending on the circuit. So if you hit the Nürburgring, you'd have a short tail because you want the downforce, such as it was back then. And at places like Le Mans, you would tend to go for the long tail because you just want top speed. And they sorted about it. So even the long tail in 1970 was stable in a way it simply hadn't been in 1969. But yes, I mean, the cars, the bodywork changed dramatically. But some drivers, Richard Atwood won Le Mans in 1970 with a short tail car because he just wanted the most stable platform he could. I suspect because he'd been scared witless the year before. And because the weather was so bad, and because there was so much attrition, he still won the race. In a car, and by then they had 5-litre engines and they had 5-speed gearboxes. And he went, no, I'll have a 4.5-litre engine, I'll have a 4-litre gear, I'll have a 4-speed gearbox, and I'll have a short tail. So basically, he optimized his car. Well, no, he de-optimized his car. He basically went out and raced the worst 917 you could possibly get for doing Le Mans in it, and he still won it.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it, really? Okay, I should have mentioned earlier, just an interesting detail of this car. So the space frame chassis was always pressurized with gas, and there's a little dial, isn't there, somewhere on the chassis? So that
I think it was only in the early cars they used to do this. Right? Yes. Yeah. So and why do they pressurize it?
Well, so that if it loses pressure, they know there's a crack in the chassis.
Yes. Which isn't terribly reassuring, isn't it? You kind of think that you'd want a chassis which wasn't going to crack.
Going to crack, yeah. You shouldn't need that feature.
You had this big gauge and years like that, and the moment, and then it was, and if you sort of looked up and it had done that, it was time to go into the pits.
Crikey! Can we put this right once and for all? Are we calling it 917 or 917? Doesn't change a lot. No,
I just don't care. I think I use both. I think I've probably used both during the course of this podcast.
Yeah.
I tend to normally say 917, but I don't. Yeah, I'm not. It's not like sort of 911 and 911. I mean, no one would say 911, would they? Because it doesn't trip off the tongue the same way. But what do I think? I think Porsche. Yeah, Porsche 911. I think I used to say 917. I'd probably say 917 now, but I don't care.
No, it doesn't matter, does it? It's not important.
No.
Okay, so the car was developed a lot for 1970. Won Le Mans in 70 and 71. So huge success. It's winning elsewhere. Where should we go from here? I mean, should we talk about some of the variants? Should we skip across the Atlantic and talk about Can-Am?
I mean, we definitely have to talk about Can-Am. I mean, I think so the political situation on the ground at the time is interesting, because obviously, having gone so far out of its way to make sure that a 917 or 917 couldn't get built, and the car getting built anyway. I mean, the FIA, was it the CSI at the time? The one became the other, doesn't matter. The rule makers, they still, the fundamental problem didn't just remain; it was getting worse. These cars were still getting faster and faster and faster. And so they had to, and Porsche would have known this from the start. They had to find a way to outlaw these cars, and it took them 2 seasons to do it. But eventually, they just said, "Right, 3 liters, that's it. Forget the 25 car rule. You literally can't race any kind of prototype with more than a 3-liter capacity." And that really was the end of the 917. But by then, the only places it didn't race successfully were at the Nürburgring on the Targa Florio. But Porsche had the 908 for that. So, so it was, so obviously Porsche won the World Sports Car Championship in both those years, in 1970 and 1971. But you have to remember, it wasn't all the 917. The 908 did the races on the, on the more fiddly circuits. They did do some simulations between a 908 and a 917 at the Nürburgring, and actually the lap times came out remarkably similar. But the difference was, the drivers of the 917s aged 10 years during the course of the race, whereas the guys in the 908 had a really nice time. So, and frankly, it was just more likely that you get a 908 to the end of it than a 917. So, they did go at it with both cars. Also, the Ferrari is interesting, because Ferrari and also how Porsche managed to completely screw with Ferrari's heads. Ferrari obviously realized from the outset the 512S just wasn't as good as the 917. Only won one race, it won Sebring in 1970 with Mario Andretti driving, and that's because all the 917s retired. That's the race in which Steve McQueen came second, driving with Peter Revson, and Revson did almost all the driving, and McQueen took almost all the credit, and I can get quite old-fashioned about that. But anyway, Ferrari realized they obviously needed to do something about this, and so they produced a car called the 512M for Modificato, which was kind of the car the 512S should have been from the start. And it could have been an amazing car. They only went head to head once. I think it was in Austria, and the Ferrari beat the Porsche on merit. But by that stage, the organizers had already announced this 3-litre formula, and Ferrari were just piling everything into that because, unlike Porsche, Ferrari already had a 3-litre engine because they were doing Formula One. So it was very easy for Ferrari to adapt their F1 engine and have a 3-litre engine and continue sports car racing. And in 1972, after Porsche left sports cars racing, the 1972 World Championship had 11 races in it. Ferrari won 10 and didn't enter the 11th. So that gives you an idea. So that's why Ferrari. But in the meantime, the 512M. So Ferrari abandoned the 512M, which was such a shame because I think that could have been the most fantastic battle in 1971 with the 970s. But the other thing that Porsche did was they were thinking about what they could do in Can-Am, because you needed much more power than 917 had to do Can-Am. And one of the ideas that they had was producing a flat 16 engine. And so they published a photograph of their flat 12 engine with their flat 16 engine next to it, but they scaled down the flat 16 engine to make it look like the same. It was physically the same size as the flat 12, and made Ferrari think they'd done a 5-litre flat 16, which they could go sports car racing with, which they absolutely couldn't. It was only ever going to be a flat Can-Am engine. And I think that made Ferrari think, oh, well, we just got no hope against that. So we'll just give up 1971 and we'll concentrate on a 3-litre car. So Porsche effectively fooled Ferrari into thinking they had an engine which well, I mean, although the engine ran, it never raced. And if even it had raced, it would only ever have raced in Can-Am. But Ferrari didn't know that at the time. So that was a bit of smoke and mirrors from Porsche there, which was very clever. Yeah, great story.
That is brilliant. Yeah. So after it stopped racing in Europe, it had a career across the pond, didn't it? They took the roof off it, put 2 turbos on it.
So Joe Siffert had always been banging on about Can-Am, and he'd gone over there. He had a thing called the PA Spider, which was actually, that was the car that they put the flat 16 into, and he tested it and everything else, but it never raced. But he'd done Can-Am with the PA Spider with a normal flat 12 in it, and he'd done quite well at times, but the car just didn't have the power. But he was convinced that a 917 with the power to combat particularly the McLarens, things like the M8D and the M8F, could have been where Porsche needed to go next. And also Porsche didn't like being told what to do, what it could and couldn't race in. So they just thought, well, if we can't race in the World Sports Car Championship, well, sod you, we'll go and do Can-Am instead. And so, but the problem was that even in full sort of 5-litre, 5+ litre capacity, 917 probably didn't have more than about 630, 640 horsepower. Whereas the McLarens were knocking up around 800, 850 horsepower with their monstrous 9.2 litre Chevy V8s. So Porsche needed an awful lot of power from somewhere, and they investigated 2 routes. One was the flat 16, and the other was this newfangled technology called turbocharging. And as soon as they turbocharged what they already had and saw the results, they knew that was the way to go. I mean, it wasn't the matter of the moment because the technology was in its infancy, and you can imagine what those early 917s. So they created a thing called the 91710, which eventually went on to have 1,000 horsepower. But in this in this car with this very short wheelbase and pretty much an on-off throttle response, it must have been impossible to drive, very, very difficult to drive. But the moment the 91710 came along, the McLaren era of total domination. McLaren had dominated Can-Am almost since its inception. Didn't win the first year. Lola won it in 65, I think, 66 anyway. But after that, McLaren just literally dominated everything. And Porsche came along and ended that. And the 91710 won almost everything in 1972. And then they created the 91730. which had even more power. But more significantly, it had a longer wheelbase. So it was actually a much easier car to drive. And yeah, it won every single race. Mark Donoghue, and that pretty much killed Can-Am, because again, the 917 had got so fast that people were just thinking, well, what's the point? And so, it didn't kill world sports car racing. They had to get rid of the 917, but in Can-Am, it basically, and it did carry on for a bit after that, but it was never the same again after the 917-30. 1100 horsepower and, just hours faster than anything else out there.
Bloody hell. God, I can only imagine what that feels like. Although, what that feels like. So just to round things up.
I have an idea. Yes, I have an idea. But I think I've banged on about driving that car for this podcast in the past.
Just to wrap things up then, can we very briefly talk about the 917s that you have driven? Is it just the one?
970s, all those 970s. I've driven two.
Yeah.
So I drove, but they are, funnily enough, they are the sort of two poles of the sort of 917 era. So I drove, Richard Atwood let me drive his car, which looked like the Le Mans winner. It wasn't. It was the next chassis along. And it had spent most of its life. It was a camera car for Le Mans, but this was to absolute 1970 Le Mans winning specifications. So it was in Salzburg livery, a 4.5 litre engine, 4-speed gearbox, short tail, and I drove that at Silverstone long time ago. And the only thing that he was interested in was making sure that I'd really driven this thing. And I kept on sort of coming in. He'd lean in and he'd say, what was it like? And I go, well, I think this, that, and the other. He goes, yes, but have you had a proper go yet? And I go, well, I think so. He said, well, just get out and do so. And so we had Silverstone to ourselves the day back in the day when we could afford to rent such thing. And yeah, we had to stop and take photographs and that sort of thing. But basically, I drove that car all day at Silverstone. I still think that's probably the greatest thing I've ever done in my career, just because of the amount of time I spent in the car, and because although I wasn't doing it in the wet or with all those other lunatics or at a dangerous circuit like Le Mans in the 1970s, I did drive a 917 as fast as I could make it go, until I was so tired I really couldn't think about driving it anymore. So that was amazing. And then much more recently, at the members meeting 2-3 years ago, Goodwood. They put me in the 917-30, and it was a strange thing, because you think to yourself, oh God, it's got all this power and the car is so old, and it's a 970, and you think it's just going to be impossible. It's just going to try and kill me the moment I get out there. And it didn't. That was the amazing thing about it. It was so well developed by then. With cars like that, you kind of get an instinctive feel almost from the outside as to whether it's going to be on your side or not, and it just was. And these were demonstration laps. We weren't allowed to overtake anybody, and I had a bloke on a 917-10 in front of me who was going terribly slowly. So it was slightly compromised, because I had to sort of hold back and then give myself almost a sort of lap to catch this bloke up again. But I did manage to do it, and I did manage to, within the bounds of what is sort of safe and sensible and not taking any risk, drive that car as fast as I felt comfortable driving it. It did spin its wheels at about 125, 130 miles an hour down the far end of the Goodwood Straight, approaching turn 1, which I've got on camera, which was the most extraordinary thing. It was fast beyond my abilities to describe, but it wasn't that scary. I wasn't sitting there thinking, I was just sitting there, just not being able to believe my luck, being able to get in such a car. I wasn't sitting there thinking, oh God, I'm going to crash. It just wasn't like that at all. It was a lovely car to drive.
But that's the thing about great racing cars, isn't it? They have to be drivable. Even for professionals, they have to be relatively approachable. Otherwise, they don't win.
No, exactly. Because you can have all the potential in the world, but if the bloke behind the wheel can't exploit it, then there's literally no point. And I think that's what I think that's the great thing. That's the great. Everybody thinks about the 917-30 and they think about the 1100 horsepower. It wasn't actually. The great achievement of that car was the way that that Mark Donoghue and Penske developed that car with Porsche so that it could, even back then on the tires that they had with the turbo technology they had, which was so primitive, it could deploy that power. And that's really where the speed came from.
Wow.
What a thing. What a thing.
There you go. Porsche 917, 917, whichever you prefer. Yeah, what a heroic car. Sadly, I suspect I'll never get to drive one.
Never say never.
No, well, I know. If anyone owns one, get in touch.
Well, I never thought I'd drive one. And I've driven two. So, and I'm a lot older than you. So, you're talking, and the thing with Porsche is they don't sort of, put these cars in frames and hang them on walls. They get them out there.
They do.
So, I really hope that you do.
We'll see. Let's hope so. Okay. All right. Well, that was really good. That's the 917, everybody. Please remember to rate and review the podcast. That really does help. It helps us grow, find new listeners, which we like. Hello, if you are a new listener. And also go and download the Intercooler app. Just go onto the App Store, either App Store, search the Intercooler. You'll find it there. You can start your free trial. Should we just do 30 seconds on what the Intercooler app actually is all about? Because it's a while since we've done that, isn't it? We've built what we think is the best writing team that any title anywhere in the world within automotive can boast about. Apart from us, we've also got Henry Catchpole and Karun Chandok. We've got David Tuig, who's a very, very experienced car engineer who writes beautifully. We've got Julian Thompson, who's, again, a very experienced car designer who writes beautifully. And we've got some of the biggest names from what is perhaps the heyday of car journalism, Mel Nichols, Peter Robinson, and other guys as well. It's a heck of a lineup, isn't it?
It is, yeah. We've got guys like Andrew English, who's been the Telegraph's car man for the last 25 years, and we got Colin Goodwin, our agony aunt, and Ben Oliver, who's one of the greatest car columnists that there is. We have we're blessed to have access to these amazing people. And every single day, one of them writes something for us, and we put it on the app first thing in the morning. And and the idea is just that it's the quality of journalism you might hope to find in a big glossy quarterly publication, and are prepared to wait a quarter of a year for it to turn up. We provide that every day, every single day, apart from Sundays. There will be something of that quality, brand new on the app. And that's really it. That's the idea behind it. It's gone very well so far. We're only 6 months in. We are. Don't take our word for it. Go on the app stores, look at the ratings, look at the reviews, and you'll see what people think of it. We're terribly proud of it. We can say this because the vast majority of the work on there isn't ours. We just run it and had the idea for it, and go and have a trial. Try it for a month, see what you think. We think hope you'll like it.
Yeah, you can start your free trial for a month. It's $4.99 a month thereafter, $49.99 for the year. Just go and check it out and let us know what you think. But as ever, we'll be back with another podcast this time next week.
Look forward to it. All the best.